Welcome to the Going Green podcast. And today we're going to look at going white.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well, no.
white Christmases. How often have we had a white Christmas? And are we going to get any white Christmases? And something about sort of weather and climate, which also is a confusing thing because people do confuse them rather a lot. And we'll be looking at various things about the weather.
Or more
Okay.
precisely, about snow.
Yes, snow. Now, we've just come out of having some snow. It snowed last week. Not much. We had 4 centimeters of snow, but we were in a cold snap. And so we had 2 weeks of quite cold. So it was very cold before it snowed. And then it stayed cold. And so, of course, the snow stayed around. So although we actually did manage a couple of bright days, we did actually manage a lot of very foggy, miserable, horrible days when we made no solar energy whatsoever. But you can get some nice bright days as well when the snow does actually magically disappear by sublimation.
Yes.
Yes. Anyway, I remember when I was a kid, the year of 1962, and it snowed, my mum says, on Boxing Day, and it stayed until March. Now, I was only little. I was about 6. I couldn't tell you which day it was, but I do remember that basically we lived in a little village and the school was on the top of the hill, and getting up to the top of the hill to the school was incredibly difficult. And my dad had a job. He was a driving instructor, and he didn't do any work for sort of best part of couple of months because the roads were sort of impassable. In fact, our house, the road to our house was impassable for weeks. And I remember having to go and plod through the snow to try and get exciting things like milk and bread. But I talk to you about this sort of stuff, this sort of snow, and you go, Paul, you go, what?
Well, the answer is I don't. We've been a bit better, and the conditions of when our snow happens have become a lot better. The things like the gritters come out a bit earlier, and the gritters are more aware because they can predict the weather a bit better, and they know sort of what time it's going to snow. And it's the advancements of those sort of things that allow for better predictions and those sort of things. But the next important thing, of course, is there were more cars going around, so therefore the major roads basically snow couldn't lie on them, and so effectively it was only in the small our little, I say, not cul-de-sac because it's but our little area, our road, which was the worst one. But as soon as we hit out on any minor arterial road, it was fine, and then obviously the major ones, no problem at all. So
We have to be honest. When our road does a sort of an S bend, and the worst bit was outside our house. The rest of the road actually did get clear. It was just our bit outside. We looked out and we thought it was still sort of icy and snowy right across the road.
deepest, darkest,
But you walked around the corner, and in fact, the road was sort of, well, it had tire tracks through it, didn't it?
yeah.
Sort of.
So as I said, so it's not as bad. But yes, this is one of those odd things where I don't remember it being sort of snow from like I remember a few occasional things like it snowing in April. Just a random batch of, what was it, March? I can't
No,
remember.
it was
I swear
end
it
of
was.
March, beginning of April. Yes, we went to do Easter. Talking of Christmas, of course. Yeah, so we went to Easter. We went to the Festival of Light, 5 o'clock in the morning. We went outside and we did some sort of singing of some hymns. We went in, and then the service finished at 7 o'clock, and the priest opened the west doors. We all marched out into an absolute blizzard.
Yes.
And instead of all the kids then going to have breakfast before the next service,
We had a snowball fight.
yeah,
Yeah.
and they had a lovely time.
Yeah.
But let's go back to white Christmases. Right, so what's the definition of a white Christmas? and it's changed a little bit. It used to be when snow was observed on the Met Office building in London. However, now an official white Christmas is defined by the Met Office as one, one
Solid,
snowflake,
one
one solitary
solitary. Gotta
snowflake.
be that one.
Yeah, observed falling in the 24 hours on the 25th of December somewhere in the UK.
Yes, and then you got to remember the Met Office. They have sort of something daft like over 267. It might be 68 or something. Weather stations around the UK, and this is where they basically gather the official measurements of the weather in. I say those locations, but it's the it's to give the accurate picture so they can measure all the different sites. So they have the official areas where they actually record things, and if it snows or snowflake is observed at any one of those sites, that's when it's declared a white Christmas.
So we've had down here several white Christmases where you look outside and the grass is beautifully green and not a snowflake in sight. But I remember going to my grand's when I was a little kid. Now, I think it's 66. And I went, and it was a nice day. We had Christmas in the morning, and then we packed everything up and we drove just across town, Southampton, to my grand's, and we had dinner. And then we looked outside, and it was getting to about 3 o'clock, and it was starting to snow. And I said, "It's snowing. Let's go out and play." And my mum and my gran said, "You haven't brought any wellies. You're not allowed to go out in the snow." And so we didn't. And I was very upset about that. And then we battled home in the car in the snow. And it took, well, I don't know if it, well, no, it was little. So it felt like hours trying to get home. But we had to get my mum out pushing a few times.
Yeah. So it's one of those things where as we're stating that it's huge. I can tell you that the last year, 2021, the UK did actually record some snow falling on Christmas, and so technically last year was a white Christmas under the obviously the definition. But one of the critical things pointed, it was only 6% of stations recorded this, but only 1% of these stations recorded any snow lying on the ground last year, just to show you what the hell's happening.
Yeah.
And it's just one of those odd things where it does get cold, it is chilly, all these snow, and that's, it doesn't have to be cold for it to snow, but it actually, there's certain conditions requiring it to be snow. Don't get me wrong, the cold helps it's to stay on to help it, not preserve it, that's the wrong way to put it, but it's sort of, you need cold weather, but you don't
Yeah.
actually need the cold weather initially. You could be warm and they become a cold, because it's basically snow falls when it's
Snow tends to fall more in sort of January to sort of March, I suppose, than it does in December. And of course, if you think back to your history, Paul,
Uh-oh.
oh yeah, this isn't good. Um, White Christmases were more frequent in the 18th and 19th century, uh, and they were even more so before the change of the calendar in 1752, which effectively brought Christmas Day back by whole 12 days.
Oh,
So basically, if you were in the sort of, oh, I don't know, 1300s to onwards, we had this sort of little mini ice age taking place, which we've effectively just about left now. And so we did get more white Christmases, especially because the days were sort of, we were really in January and December.
yes.
But basically, the chances of, snow falling in December, we get on average only about 4 days, whereas in January it's about 5 days, February it's 5.5 days, and March it's back to only about 4 days. So basically, the weather, of course, lags behind the season. Of course, we say it's got to winter, but the Earth takes still time to cool down. So we've just passed the winter solstice, but we haven't got to the coldest part of the year yet. It should be the coldest part, but it takes the weather a long time to sort of react, and it's always a few weeks behind where the sun is, which is why we often get a much hotter July than we do June, when it's the longest time.
Yes.
And although, of course, we think of the shortest day, our friends down in Australia, that was you one year, wasn't it?
Yeah, we celebrated the longest day of the year. It was glorious.
Yeah, Christmas Day, you threw a shrimp on the
I
barbie,
put a
didn't you?
shrimp on the barbie. Yes, I did.
On the beach?
On the beach. I would say in midday, but we didn't because we were in the shelter because it's too balmy hot. The dumb story. But you know what? Talking about, say, lagging behind and the weather lagging behind. Currently, I say now, in basically a couple of days, America is going to be suffering this huge Arctic, I say plume, this Arctic
Vortex, isn't it?
and it's diving down to about halfway in the middle of the country, and that's terrible. I can read some of the temperatures they're expected to get to.
Are you going to give them in real numbers, or are you going to frighten me in
Well,
Fahrenheit?
the coldest they're going to get, which is actually north near the Canadian border, they said that's going to be -6, and we read that, and that was -21 Celsius.
Yeah, -6 Fahrenheit.
-6
yes.
Fahrenheit. But places balmy, sort of, I don't know, like Florida, they're only getting to 6, or they're going down to 6, which is quite
Celsius.
6 Celsius, yes, which is quite balmy. Now, the reason we say this is because it's bad for America that they're getting all this cold snap, and that's sad and upset. But the polar vortex that they're suffering undulates, and effectively we lag behind whatever weather happening in America by approximately 6 weeks, which means, of course, in February we're not expected to get this cold snap again, but we're likely to get a significant portion of this cold snap coming through because of how the polar vortex undulates up and down and causes all sorts of, not havoc, that's the wrong way to put it, but it essentially causes a great deal of problems. But they said that Florida getting down to sort of 6 degrees Celsius, the last recorded time they did that was, funny enough, when the last polar vortex went down below America, and they said they only got to they only got to about 8. So this is actually colder than the last time this happened, which is quite not a significant thing, but
this is extremes, isn't it, Paul? This is, when we're talking about climate change, we are talking about perhaps the extremes get bigger.
yes, because it's one of those odd things where you hear about climate change. You hear about, we're getting warmer, the global warming, and yet the winters are getting colder. And the actual fact, technically, here in the UK, the average temperature for winter is actually going up. But unfortunately, that's the average. That's the year upon year average. However, the unfortunate thing is that because it's an average, it doesn't account for when days were cold and when days were warm. It basically just averages them together. That's why it's an average. And so you're finding that it is on average going up, but inside the average, the range is actually getting bigger. And so when it's cold, it's colder, and when it's warm, it's warmer. And so suddenly now you've got this two effectively large dynamic range of, if it's cold, it is really cold, and if it's warm, it's really warm.
But you were talking about one thing about the cold. There's a difference between having sort of a cold period and a cold snap. And when you have this cold snap, it feels colder than perhaps, it really is.
Yeah, no, I was talking about this. It's just one of those odd things where if you basically have a slow, gradual shift to the cold, like, yeah, let's say you're plummeting a degree every day from 10 to 0 over 10 days. That's just wondering, right? Uh, you're more naturally used to sort of it's getting colder, and then that 0, you'll quite happily live because it wasn't warm to go with. But the reason that I say the cold snaps are bad is that suddenly went from a balmy 20 in November to suddenly nearly 0 in the next week. And so over that 10 days, we dropped 20 degrees.
And that's what made
Um,
it feel colder, wasn't it?
yeah, and that's why it's defined as a cold snap because it was basically not overnight, but it was actually 2 days.
Well, just before you were born, I remember that I used to commute to work, and I drove up from Southampton to Hemel Hempstead, and I drove up the motorway, the M3. And I remember leaving early one morning, and it was very, very cold. And in fact, I know how cold it was. It was minus 17 Celsius here, and we had a very, very cold snap. And as I drove up the M3, the hard shoulder was fully occupied by lorries, and all the lorries were on the hard shoulder stopped, and that was because their diesel had frozen.
Yes. Well, yeah, this is the problem. You see, this is when you get this cold snap and you get this cold for a long time. Things you don't expect to freeze.
Yeah,
You know,
but you see, that was minus 17. Here we got what, about minus 2. Generally it was only sort of that here. Uh, yes, we did get other bits that dipped. So if you're out more in the countryside, and the taxi driver that came to pick the little boy up next door, he lived more in the countryside. And said it got down to -8, whereas in the towns they stay warmer.
yes. And we've known this, and this is a major problem. You have got urban heating, I wouldn't say districts, but urban heating centers where basically, we've got all this concrete. And concrete absorbs heat from the sun, and any sun it radiates and it keeps warm because that's what concrete does. And so that generally keep things warmer. Whereas nice villages in the middle of nowhere, they don't have all this conflict, concrete, and so they can't keep warm. Therefore, they are colder. Yeah, it's just one of
Yeah.
those odd things. Yeah, they were talking about. I say with this, there was polar vortex in America. How much of the you need to everybody needs all the farmers they're having to get the cattle in and the sort of all their livestock in because it will be so cold that it will not. Yeah, they
That
will
can kill them.
it will kill them easily, no problem. They said get the electric blankets out and sort of it's a major problem for them, which is a not a good sign, but that's just how it goes. Um,
But I've talked to my friend Joe. Joe lives in Pennsylvania, and I sent him a picture of snow, and we had sort of perhaps 6 inches of snow, and he said, "You don't call that snow? This is snow." And he sent me a picture back of sort of him opening the door and barely looking over the snow that's piled up against his door.
yeah, well, they unfortunately they have a moan about being what really is snow. You go to Finland, it's always snow. You talk to Russia, it's their deepest, darkest. I remember them talking daftly about the airport when we were having a bit of snow a couple of years ago. This is when we were nice to Russia, and they were talking about how does Russia deal with snow. And the answer is they've got snowplows, and they just deal with it because well, it snows all the time. Whereas here in the UK, people say a little tiny bit of snow basically destroys the country. And the reason it destroys the country is because we haven't got not the infrastructure to do so. But you see, we get snow for one day. Let's say you want to buy a snowplow. Well, it's a pretty much a problem because well, we only got one day and you got these fleet of vehicles that aren't being useful and it's bad economics. So you say, oh, let's hire them. Hire them from where? And they say, oh, let's go hire them from Europe. Problem is that when it snows for us, it usually snows in Europe, so the snowplows in Europe are so It doesn't make sense. Where in Russia, it snows for approximately 4 months of the year. Is it economical to have snowplows? So the answer is yes. So this is the whole small conversation you hear generally, sort of like, oh, how unprepared we are in the UK for snow. The answer is, if you only get snow once a year, then you get disruptions once a year, because there's no point in having protection against for once in the year. It's like having protection for once in a lifetime events. It's a once in a lifetime. You cannot be prepared for those things.
You can.
I know you can, but people say, "Oh, but it happens every year. Surely we should just get them." There's a whole problem of people moaning and saying what's happening, but that's the reason why we don't have the snow plows, is because, and we're not prepared for the snow, even though we should be, because we've got all this data. We know the snow cap. We're getting warnings of the snow snap coming. It's like, as I said, we know that we lag behind America and this polar vortex, and we're saying in about 6 weeks we're gonna get this cold snap. Mark my words, in February there'll be a cold snap. We know this, and one of the more important parts of that is that we need to be prepared for this.
So we get our famous beast from the east and the sudden stratospheric warming that, is signs of things to come. Right. Okay. Let's ask a little question then, Paul, about snow falls on Christmas Day.
Uh-oh.
Right. Okay. So when was the last one you remember?
Well, I'm going to say 2010.
That was quite a good one.
That was a good one. I remember that one.
2016 was another one that we had. But when I look at the days when it was snowing, and I can cheat 'cause I can go back and look over the last sort of 20 years or worse, 40 years of photographs. And typically, I don't necessarily take a picture every day, but I do tend to take a picture when it snows. And 2016 was quite a good year. I remember sort of coming back from my parents. We went down there and there was no snow there, whereas we came back up to here, which is near London, and that there was some sort of snow, and a fair bit of it as well. So 2016 was a white Christmas. 2015, 14, and 13 were. 2010, 9, and then we had a break, 2004, 2001, and then we had a whole flurry of years. But there was quite an interesting one that I saw, and I was really quite surprised at looking at this. And when I had a look, there was no recorded snow falling in any station in the UK in the whole of 2018 or 2019.
And you want to know why that was, and not the sense that it wasn't just no snow. It was actually the weather conditions in those years of around winter time, and you find that actually snow, or to have snowfall, actually requires a few things to happen. And so, okay, first off, it needs to be cold. Now, it doesn't have to be cold where you are; it just has to be cold somewhere, right? The cold then needs to meet humid air, because that's bringing all the water, and so, that's how the snowflakes form. They have this cold, all the moist air goes in, that allows it to basically turn into snow. And then once it's formed snow, it then needs to basically move along to some place where suddenly it gets a bit hot. And I say a bit hot, I mean hotter than obviously the cold. And in this pool of sort of hot locations / cold locations, it basically, the snow forms, and then it basically is precipitated out, as in it just falls. And that's how you get snow falling. And so if it's just cold all over, and there's humid air coming through, and it's just cold humid air, you won't actually get the snowfall. It needs to meet somewhere hot, or I say hot in this case, it's
Warmer.
Yeah, And that's the one of the conditions, which is the problem, you see, which is why we didn't in those years, we didn't get things because, well, didn't meet a warm place. Because I remember those being quite cold years, or even actually, I think I remember them to be actually warm years. So we didn't have the cold initially for when the humid air to come through to turn into
Yeah.
snow.
So 2021 was the last proper white Christmas. We keep our fingers crossed whether it will be a white Christmas in England if, one snowflake falls somewhere in England. Uh, so the last white Christmas in the UK was 2021. But only sort of that was 1% of sort of stations reported snow lying on the ground, and 6% sort of recorded snow falling. There's also a difference between a snowflake falling and, of course, it's actually lying. Um, to see sort of snow falling is one thing, but really to be proper snow, it's got to lay.
Well, yes,
So that's the point I was trying to make. Sort of, you know, for someone to say it's a white Christmas, they want to look outside on Christmas Day and they want to see the snow lying on the ground. They don't care whether it is actually snowing or not. They want to see snow lying on the ground, and trying to find that is much more difficult.
Well, I mean, you can always go to some place, like in Scotland, where in the Highlands on the mountain tops, that's a good
Yeah,
place.
well, even in England, you can do that. You can go up to the sort of on higher ground. We tend to get more snow. Really, it's got to count to sort of get down to low levels. So our last proper white Christmas in the UK was 2010, and it was really quite unusual in that there was snow lying on the ground on 83% of the Met Office's sort of stations. Uh, and it also recorded that we got 19% of those stations actually saw snow. So it's sort of getting your statistics right. It's sort of trying to look at these things and say, yeah, what do we actually mean by a white Christmas? To me, a white Christmas has got to have snow lying on the ground. I don't care whether it's actually snowing on that day, but that's not what the Met Office go for. They want snowing on Christmas Day.
Yeah.
Um,
And one of the more important things about, of course, snow, gently falling, is that it's a very good indicator for climate change.
yeah,
And you might say why, and there's a big daft, because you've got to look at how a snowflake forms. It forms around a bit of dust or a bit of dirt or something. And basically, if you go to somewhere like the Arctic, which is unfortunately melting, you can actually see the layers of ice which captures these snowflakes and these peaks of dust, and you can actually see the particulates in the atmosphere for every, I say, layer and sheet of ice, which means, of course, we can tell how much of the it's like, as I say, the mini ice age that happened. We know that the mini ice age happened because of how much snow fell,
yeah. Dickensian period, yes.
and one of the major things people say is why it was a mini ice age was because suddenly there was a lot of particulates in the air, and so that actually helped with the formation of the mini ice age. And so now in this year when we're working on these climate goals of working about air quality and pollution and making sure particulates are low, perhaps snow formation is actually reduced. So
Yeah.
perhaps we can't now be using snow as an indicator.
So let's finish, Paul, by asking the question, really, uh, white Christmases,
Yes.
proper white Christmases, what I call a white Christmas, snow lying on the ground. Well, we've only had 4 occasions since 1960. They were 1981, 1995, 2009, and 2010. So, Paul, what is your prediction for a white Christmas this year?
I'm unfortunately going to be a bar humbug person Basically, unfortunately, I don't reckon it's that likely. The chances of it's going to have to be astronomical. Like it's going to be, freak of nature for actually falling and doing something.
Well, snow lying on the ground, yes, I think so. But how about one snowflake falling on one Met Office station this year? What's your predictions?
Now that, as I say, it relates to the whole thing of I think it's rather poor in relation to it's probably not going to happen. I'm afraid.
So, yeah,
I'm sorry.
unfortunately, I agree with you. I think the chances of a white Christmas this year in the UK have gone.
Now in the UK, bit different.
However, yeah, well, yes, the UK, Scotland, and other places might get some snow, but let's say England then.
With England, no,
No.
sad.
So, we wish you a Merry Christmas. If you're in the UK, you might get an odd little bit of snow if you're living in the sort of higher bits. If you're living in other parts of the world, then, well, you might stand a good chance of getting some snow. If you're down in Australia,
Wish you luck.
yeah, really do wish you good luck to get some snow on Christmas Day there. So it's from Paul and I. We wish you a happy Christmas, and we'll see you again, hopefully next week, when we want to do the year roundup.
Yeah, but year in review.
The year in review. So until then, it's goodbye from me.
And a goodbye from me.
Bye bye.
Bye.